President Trump cutting off all trade talks with Canada after the country sponsored this ad.
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse.
President Reagan's foundation says Canada, Ontario to be specific, falsely portrayed Ronald Reagan as anti-tariff. And Canada did not receive permission to use those remarks. President Trump writing on Truth Social, quote, Canada is trying to illegally influence the Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs. They cannot take advantage of America any longer. How does it play out?
So one wonders if the president isn't being a little thin-skinned here. I mean, hitting a country with huge tariffs because they ran an ad. I don't know. And when you look at Wall Street and how they're having to react.
Well, he didn't give them new tariffs,
no,
right?
He just
pulled back on the negotiations.
Right, yes.
Okay.
But when you look at Wall Street having to deal with these shifting gears on an ongoing basis on these tariffs, it can be a little difficult. Now, is it disingenuous for them to say that? Yeah, because Reagan did use tariffs here and there. But no, because Reagan really was a supply sider and very Milton Friedman-esque, and Milton Friedman was against all tariffs. But Milton Friedman didn't have to deal with things like what China is doing right now. You weren't having to deal with a superpower that was wrecking some of your industries on purpose. So all of this economic theory is being thrown on its head. None of it is being used as it was originally written. The Keynesians are supposed to pull back when the economy does a little better. Nobody pulls back. Washington never pulls back. Spending only goes up. And the supply siders are supposed to be about small government. We've never shrunk the government. We're trying to a little bit, but it's a lounge chair off the Titanic.
Well, Ronald Reagan they didn't repeal the chicken tax on imported small trucks during Reagan's 2 terms in office. And that's been a great benefit to the American automakers all of these years, ever since it was put in place. And when LBJ was the president, I could go on. And maybe Reagan didn't use tariffs specifically, but he certainly used a big stick when it came to dealing with Japan, and Japan throttled exports of its vehicles into the U.S. because the U.S. automakers were flat on their back, and he didn't want to give Chrysler, he didn't want to hand out more bailouts after the Chrysler bailout. I digress. We have the upper hand over Canada. Pure and simple, FAFO, FAFO, y'all.
Whoa.
You think you're making a joke? Well, here's your joke, and you can stick it where the sun does not shine.
By the way, another thing that Ronald Reagan was doing, besides tariffing Japan, and we were talking before about Intel, a lot of it had to do with Intel kind of lost the edge in chip manufacturing against Japan. At the time, we had represented, when I was working at the Journal, we had representatives of Intel come in and scream that we needed protection about a year before Reagan finally pulled the switch and tariffed Japan on the chips. But he also, in the part that Canada didn't play in their ad, he also was complaining about Congress removing the presidential authority to use tariffs, exactly as Donald Trump is doing right now. So in many ways, the situation that Trump is in does reflect the situation that Reagan was in. Reagan reacted more to the pressure from companies like Intel, whereas Trump is more proactive in his attempt. I don't think Reagan ever praised tariffs. He used them, but he didn't praise them as an efficient tool on a number of other issues. But he was in very similar situation to the one that Trump is now in, both on the tariffing and on the issue of maintaining presidential control of that process.
100% tariffs on semiconductors and other electronics from Reagan on Japanese products.
You know, you could do yourself a favor on this Friday. Go to the Reagan Library, go to the archives, read his radio address to the nation on free and fair trade. It'll take you 2 minutes, and you can get his whole theory, okay? He said, this is how he defended the tariffs he did, okay? We had clear evidence that Japanese companies were engaging in unfair trade practices that violated an agreement between Japan and the U.S. So that's his threshold for using tariffs. And he did it. But he also said homegrown industries, when you have tariffs, start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop competing. They stop making the innovative management and technological changes they need to succeed in a world market. So that's the Reagan view. The Canada commercial distorted that. But it's also true that he was a supply-side guy who saw limited use of tariffs. This is the thing about like the world we live in right now. If you want to understand the upside-down economics, what you need to do is go read the guys who everyone's citing and find out what they really said. Because what you find out is they're usually getting distorted one side or the other. And there's usually some logic to what they're doing. And in 2 minutes in a radio address, Reagan laid that out. And it's not that far off from what Trump is trying to do with China.
And there's something being lost here, because the biggest things that Trump's doing are very positive, and they're very Reagan-esque. That is lowering regulations and lowering taxes. That puts more money in the hands of the private sector. That's why I'm a little jumpy when he's entering, he's kind of mixing the public and the private sector on these companies. And you're right, it leads to moral hazard. It leads to companies not really reacting to price discovery as much, and instead leaning more and more on government largesse instead of trying to be more competitive, smarter, and out-technologying your competitors.
Can I just look at a different piece of it? I appreciate you guys laying out the context, because that was my first question, which is when you take something without permission, in what context, whether it's journalism, clips of interview, whatever it is, or in this case, the ad and President Reagan's words that Ontario used. But I just would say, oh, Canada, why? Why did you do this? And I know it's not Carney per se, and it's Ontario. But when you are negotiating, if we have learned anything from Donald Trump, it's that you need to know the counterparty with whom you are negotiating. Anybody that would watch this ad would know that it could make the president a little bit angry. We know how he reacts to things. We know sometimes he flies off the cuff a little bit. And you know what? He got really annoyed yesterday, and he said, okay, Canada, we're not going to talk to you anymore about this. And John Carney had to come back and, walk it back and try to make it good today. This is not going to help Canada in its plight right now with respect to how it deals with the president. At the end of the day, you can see how he's worked with other countries. He's been able to walk things back as both parties work together. If Canada wanted to do that, I would keep everything sort of behind closed doors, negotiate with the president, and get to a better place. I wouldn't antagonize him by putting ads like this out.
Amen. Slap some blue on that flag. 51st
Mark Carney,
state.
pardon me, I said John.
51st state. It's coming.
They're kind of moving away from that rhetoric a little bit.
Not here.
Last time they got
Not
together.
here. While
Maybe
we're
it'll
just,
come back now.
While we're just sticking it and poking, let's do a little of that
That'd be
too.
another blue state, though.
Yep, that's true.